I am a Ukrainian Jew. Reuven is my name. I was an inmate of the Janorska concentration camp, but I managed to escape in November 1943, thanks to a revolt staged by the Sonderkommando. I was one of the lucky ones who evaded the Nazi murderers hunting us down. I came to Palestine after the war, where I took part in Israel's War of Independence. Today, I look back on the tragedy and I offer perspective on the phenomenon known as denial. After the war and the murder of the vast majority of the Jews of Europe, after the complete destruction of the Nazi regime and the Nuremberg war crimes trials, we naively thought that anti-Semitism might diminish. Instead, we found many voices denying that the Shoah, the Holocaust, happened at all. It's hard to imagine how anyone could deny the murder of millions. Of course, 6 million is a pretty big number, and it swells to 11 million when we take into account the multitude of gypsies, homosexuals, and Jehovah's Witnesses murdered as well. But what do we say when people ask where the numbers come from? How do we know that 6 million died? How do we know there were gas chambers? But we have so much evidence, don't we? Don't we have a mountain of German records that document the genocide? We might think so, but not really. Toward the end of the war, there was in fact a top secret unit set up called Action 1005, run by Paul Blöbel, the aim of which was to hide traces of the widespread system of extermination and other evidence of the mass murder that took place under the auspices of Operation Reinhard. They went back to hundreds of murder sites, opened graves, removed bodies and burned them. Blöbel was tried and hung after the war, but he never mentioned his secret unit. And the Nazis, who regularly employed euphemism or Sprachregelung, were careful never to mention anything overtly about killing. The Jews were simply to disappear. Consequently, all those German records don't tell us as much as we think. What about all the eyewitness reports? Didn't countless people see with their own eyes what happened in those camps, just like I did? But in truth, they didn't actually see that much, and those who did see were themselves generally liquidated. As I say, I was one of the lucky ones. Others were so seriously traumatized that anything they reported was open to question. What about all the photographic evidence of the atrocities? But even the photographs and film don't identify who the victims were. The piles of bodies don't bear yellow stars. How do we know the victims weren't partisans or Russian communists? And even if we see hundreds or thousands of bodies in a photo, that doesn't amount to 6 million or 11 million. In fact, entire camps were dismantled to cover up the crimes. Consequently, even such physical evidence is open to question. That was my grandfather, Reuven. My name is Avinoam. You can call me Avi, a native-born Israeli. We in Israel have been especially affected by Holocaust denial and our need to prove that it happened. That is why Jerusalem is the location of Yad Vashem, the International Holocaust Museum. Jerusalem was also the location of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, whom Israel kidnapped from Argentina and brought here to face justice. Decades later, another trial was held here, of John Ivan Demjanjuk, suspected of being the notorious guard at Treblinka known as Ivan the Terrible. Demjanjuk was extradited to Israel in 1986. Many eyewitnesses came forward, insisting that they recognized him. But could their testimony be trusted after so many years, especially given their traumatized condition at the time? In the end, the judges in the case reluctantly acquitted Demjanjuk. We might in fact conclude that Demjanjuk was not Ivan the Terrible, even though he certainly was a terrible Ivan. In general, we can refer to Holocaust denial as a radical form of historical revisionism. Revisionism is certainly popular in historical research, and it's fine if we reinterpret history in light of new documents and other evidence. But historical revisionism of the Holocaust basically amounts to saying that it never happened, that it's a matter of Jewish propaganda. And the list of Holocaust revisionists goes back almost to the end of the war itself. In 1948 in France, the first work denying the Holocaust was published by Paul Racinier, entitled Crossing the Line. He went on to publish Debunking the Genocide Myth, a book-length collection of articles on Holocaust denial. He alleged that the Holocaust was a Zionist swindle meant to extract millions of marks from the Germans. He argued that the testimony of the survivors was untrustworthy and exaggerated. He also alleged that the SS was not responsible for the atrocities, but rather the inmates themselves who were entrusted with running the camps. In the United States, there was Austin J. Epp, who in 1965 published The 6 Million Swindle. A former professor of English at LaSalle College in Philadelphia and the University of Scranton, he claimed that only 1.5 million Jews lost their lives as partisans or spies. He also argued that the Nazis had no plan to kill all the Jewish people. They only wanted the Jews to emigrate. And this was no different from many other countries who expelled Jews in the past. As for the claim of 6 million Jews killed, he declared that the burden of proof rests on the accusers. Basically, he said, prove it. Also, in the US, we have a journal called The Myth of the 6 Million, first published in 1969. It alleges that Theresienstadt offered good conditions and complete Jewish autonomy under Jewish administration. And Red Cross reports stated that no evidence was found of a deliberate policy of extermination. Again in the US, we have Arthur Butz, a professor of electrical engineering at Northwestern University, who insisted that Zyklon B was used at the camps, but only as a disinfectant and insecticide. He gives the impression of being a serious scholar, but goes on to blame the Zionist International, the Communists, the US government, the OSS, and others for fabricating a genocide that never happened. Then there's the Institute for Historical Review, founded in 1978. It publishes the Journal of Historical Review, which appears widely on the internet and advocates for an absolutist government to protect the racial heritage of the United States. It identifies the Jews as public enemy number one. Over in Britain, there's David Irving, a military historian who has published over 20 books since 1965. In his book, Hitler's War, he claims that there never was an order by the Führer to kill all the Jews. A self-described moderate fascist, Irving is one of the most dangerous individuals involved in Holocaust denial, being familiar with historical evidence and how to bend it to conform to his own ideology. In Canada, there's Ernst Zondel, originally German, who established a publishing house that turns out anti-Semitic, racist, and Holocaust denial publications. In 1985, he was found guilty of stimulating anti-Semitism by distributing racist materials. In 1992, the Canadian Supreme Court threw out his conviction, ruling that the prohibition against spreading false news was too vague. And that raises another issue. Should there legitimately be laws against hate speech, or does this infringe on the right of free expression? In 1988, Fred Leuchter, back in the US, published a report claiming that 32 samples of concrete and brick from the so-called gas chambers at Auschwitz had been analyzed by DuPont laboratories, showing no trace of poison gas. But in 1991, a Massachusetts court convicted him for practicing engineering without a license and made him sign a letter attesting that he had never been a professional engineer. How has all this impacted the general population? Well, according to a New York-based survey, 23% of adults under 40 and 12% of all respondents believe that the Holocaust is a myth or that the number of Jews killed has been greatly exaggerated. It also found that 54% of all respondents and 59% of those aged under 40 do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered. Some 29% believe the figure is 2 million or fewer. At the end of the day, 4 issues loom largely. 1. The number of victims. 1 to 3 million in Auschwitz alone is reduced to 300,000 to 400,000. It seems that when the Russians conquered Poland at the end of the war, they deliberately exaggerated the number of victims at Auschwitz out of hatred for the Nazi regime. The real number of victims is closer to 1.25 million, as opposed to 3 million. But the fact that the number was indeed exaggerated plays right into the hands of the deniers, who reduced the number even more. 2. They claim there were no gas chambers. This is also a problem, because, as we learned, the gas chambers were systematically destroyed. 3. They claim there was no plan to kill the Jews. Another problem, because, as we learned, we don't have a written order. We have to reconstruct what happened via a series of meetings of the Nazi hierarchy in 1941. 4. They point to payment by Germany to Israel since 1953, amounting to 4.5 million Deutschmarks. Indeed, this payment did provide a major part of the Israeli budget during the 1950s. But in truth, this money had nothing to do with Holocaust victims. It was all about how much money it would cost to house 1 million Jewish survivors and refugees who found themselves in DP or displaced persons camps at the end of the war, and whom Israel now had to absorb into the new nation. As for the number 6 million, nobody denies the number of Jews alive in 1937, 16 to 17 million. At the Wannsee Conference, the Nazis recorded the exact number of Jews scattered across Europe, but by 1945, there were only 11 million Jews left. How do we know what happened to all the others? The following are the accepted numbers of those killed in the extermination camps. Chelmno, 360,000. Belzec, 500,000. Sobibor, 250,000. Treblinka, 840,000. Majdanek, 200,000, which brings us to 2,150,000. To that we add Auschwitz, 1 to 3 million. Add to this those killed by the Einsatzgruppen and in all the other concentration camps, and we easily have 6 million Jewish fatalities. And one more smoking gun piece of evidence has come to light. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Moscow archives were finally opened. Researchers were at last able to access important Holocaust documents, including a new find: the actual blueprints and engineering plans for the entire gas chamber and crematoria complex. In spite of the destruction of so much physical evidence, these documents represent compelling proof of the existence of the physical machinery of genocide. This kind of documentary evidence is virtually irrefutable. But we are still left with the question of why people are even trying to deny the Holocaust. For some, it's obviously anti-Semitism. But some deniers are not typical anti-Semites or skinheads. Some are quite sophisticated and quite intellectual. For some, money is an obvious motive. Sell enough books and one can become, like David Irving, a well-to-do celebrity of sorts. Then there's the matter of guilt, that the Allied powers knew what was going on and did nothing to stop it. If the Holocaust didn't happen, then everybody is absolved of responsibility. Perhaps deniers think to themselves, perhaps we can all become respectable anti-Semites. At the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, Chief Israeli Prosecutor Gideon Hausner offered his own take on the reality of the Holocaust.
I do not stand alone. With me here are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point their finger at the man in the dock with the cry, "I accuse," on their lips. For they are now only ashes, ashes piled high on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is stilled. Therefore will I be their spokesman. In their name will I unfold this terrible indictment. There is a Hebrew saying, "The wicked, even at the gate of hell, do not repent." In April 1945, at the moment of his death agonies, when the Soviet cannons were thundering in the streets of Berlin, when Hitler sat imprisoned in the cellar of the Reichskanzlei, his entire world in ruins, and his country stricken over the corpses of 6 million Jews. At that moment, the Führer wrote his political last will and testament. He bequeathed to his people the injunction of eternal hatred for the Jews, and he concluded, "Above all, I enjoin the government and the people to uphold the racial laws to the limit, and to resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry." Even from beyond the grave, Hitler was still sowing the seeds of hatred and destruction for the Jewish people.